Nier. Depending on who you talk to, it's either a generic and repetitive slog of an RPG that only pretentious critics enjoy, or an underrated masterpiece that breaks and critiques classic gaming conventions. And you know, I'm gonna be honest, this has probably been the toughest time I've had trying to talk about a game since starting on YouTube. And I feel like that's an accomplishment of sorts, all things considered. Like Lisa, Planescape Torment, or Ride to Hell Retribution, Nier can be a bit of a challenge to critically analyze due to its bizarre design and layers of story involved. Outside of its diehard fans that continually dig into its deeper meanings, Nier has a lot of text and subtext that most haven't even broken the surface of due to its relative niche status. But while it's admittedly no automata, this game means a lot to some people. Hell, it means a lot to me. So I'm a little on edge, because I don't want to do it a disservice by not properly doing it justice, which is why it's taken me so long to finish this video. There's just so much to grapple with that I'm not even sure where to start. So, to really talk about Nier properly, a lot of this has to be centered around the director of the game, a man by the name of Yoko Taro. Now, calling Yoko Taro an eccentric personality in the game industry would be a massive understatement. He actively avoids showing his face in public, often seen wearing a mask of one of his characters as a way to maintain the mystery of the author. He writes stage plays to go with his video games, and this is how he markets his work. In all honesty, Taro is probably the closest video games have to a David Lynch or Jodorowsky type of creator, at least in the current AAA market. Someone that makes extremely strange things that don't do well in the mainstream due to how obtruse they can be, but have a huge cult following because of how they stand out from the mainstream and challenge established norms within the medium. The first Nier is a perfect example of this, as it was an underground hit up until its sequel was released a few years later and brought more interest back into it. But even then, it has remained firmly hidden in the shadow of Automata's success, and never really broke out into the mainstream market in the same way because of how it doesn't play nice with modern game design tastes. Though I'm certain there are some rolling their eyes at this statement, thinking, dude, it's just a game where you go on a quest and repeatedly slash up enemies, it's not that deep. If Taro really was a good director, then his games would be fun to play, and then they would sell well. It's as simple as that. Which does raise a fundamental question. Does a game need to be fun to be considered good? I mean, most of Taro's history as a game developer is riddled with games that were admonished for how repetitive and frustrating they were to play. Yet he's lauded for being this amazing auteur director by pretentious game critics like myself. This dynamic dates all the way back to Taro's first directorial project, the 2003 PS2 game Drakengard. At the surface level, it's a fantasy RPG with flight simulator gameplay using dragons. But there was this creative rawness to it that made it easier to forgive the jankiness of the tacked-on hack-and-slash elements meant to compete with Dynasty Warriors at the time. Taro knew he couldn't compete with other established RPGs like Final Fantasy, so he wrote his characters to be surreal abstracts of modern tropes, taking a lot of inspiration from the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, hiding dark narratives and character studies within a straightforward premise of a medieval fantasy war. It's these surreal elements, and not the ability to fly around on a dragon, that grab people's attention, both in the East and West. Drakengard, for all its weirdness, was what put the development studio Cavia on the metaphorical map. But when it came to Drakengard 2 a couple years later, while most of the previous development staff over at Cavia were brought back on to work on the sequel, Taro was not, being replaced by Akira Yasui as the director, as Taro couldn't handle the amount of fighting he had to go through for his ideas to come through with the first game. Despite portraying himself as a silly goofball during interviews and public appearances, Taro is known for being extremely stubborn about seeing his vision through, meaning he would often clash with the publishers over at Square Enix, who were trying to make the game as profitable as possible by trying to push things that would make Drakengard appeal better to a mass market, like toning down the darker themes, or changing the blood red sky hues to a more lighthearted, inoffensive blue. Because who doesn't like blue? So with that in mind, Square Enix effectively got exactly what they wanted with the second game. Drakengard 2 was arguably a better polished product, feeling more like a mainstream adventure RPG than the first, having more refined melee combat and aesthetics. But it was missing something. By trying to appeal to modern tastes rather than questioning them, Drakengard's sequel felt more like yet another role-playing game out there, which made its flaws stand out all that much more. Not saying it was an awful game, but it was met with an overall indifference when it was released, as established fans didn't appreciate the toned-down story, and critics didn't find much that stood out about it. In hindsight, even Drakengard's producer, Takamasa Shiba, felt that Square Enix's pursuit in softening Drakengard's tone was a mistake. Regardless of the indifference it received critically though, Drakengard 2 did end up selling well, or at least well enough for a sequel, meaning a few years later, a third Drakengard game was approved by Square. And whether it was because he couldn't stay away from being involved, especially with how frustrated he got with the sequel when acting as a late-stage video editor on the project, or Square Enix and the dev team realized how central he was to the series, Taro was brought back on as a director for this new Drakengard game. But what initially started as Drakengard 3, an RPG where the world was shaped by the stories and picture books, slowly morphed into what the dev team would internally call Nier. However, despite being a new story and concept, Nier would still keep its Drakengard roots, being that it was spun off Drakengard 1's Route E ending, where in the final battle, the main characters are transported to real-world Tokyo, Japan, which goes with Taro's eccentric writing tendencies, considering that was originally meant to be a joke ending that he slipped in at the last minute. Comparatively, this would be as if PT was going to be a continuation of the dog ending in Silent Hill 2. Unlike with Drakengard 1, where there was a lot of infighting between the director and publisher over creative decisions, Square Enix chose to be fairly hands-off on the new project, meaning Taro could make the game how he wanted with little restrictions from the publisher. Though he wasn't completely untethered either, as producers still tried to nudge him in certain directions, namely towards, well...
No! Shion! Who else will I have ice cream with?
At first, Taro planned on making Nier into an epic RPG similar to something like the Star Ocean games as a way to change up what he did with Drakengard, but Square Enix producer Yusuke Saito was trying to push him somewhere closer to Kingdom Hearts. You see, in the latter half of the 2000s, outside of established series like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest, turn-based RPGs were on a decline, while more action-focused RPGs were on the rise, with the Kingdom Hearts series being a big success for Square, which then led to other series following suit. But since Kingdom Hearts was such a kid-friendly series, what with its Disney tone and aesthetic, higher-ups at Square were looking to expand on this trend with a more adult-oriented version of that style of action-focused game, which Saito was pushing Taro towards, which Taro then did partly commit to. I mean, take into consideration the shade enemies the player fights throughout the game and their place in Nier's story. Stripped down, these are a dark subversion of what the Heartless are in Kingdom Hearts, being a half of a complete whole. Except in Kingdom Hearts, fighting them is framed as the right thing to do, since it frees their hearts. Where in Nier... not so much. Now, it's hard to say if this is something Taro intentionally did, but considering the time frame and influence, it's not impossible. You can even find some possible Kingdom Hearts influence in the original concept art for Nier's main character, where he resembles someone Sora might run into in Twilight Town, down to having a Nomura-like flair to their design before they were eventually reworked into something more fitting with Taro's usual aesthetic. Though, if you're an American or European who's familiar, there's a chance you might be thinking, that's not what the main character looks like. He's supposed to be this old man with a face that looks like it was chiseled out of a brick. Well, that discrepancy is because when going over early drafts of Nier's pitch, Square Enix's American offices came back that they didn't believe a game with the usual androgynous teenage boy would appeal to Westerners like they used to, as a shift was happening with what kind of protagonist drew people in. A change that we're still seeing the effects of today. The polls were in, twinks are out, daddies are in. But Yoko Taro, being the stubborn creator he is, fiercely fought for his original design to be in the game. And the studios, not wanting to deal with the potential fallout that might come from forcing him and his team to change it, worked out a compromise, which then led to the now famous revision of creating two separate versions of the game. Nier Gestalt, which used an older father protecting his daughter as the main character for Western audiences, and Nier Replicant, which used the teenage main character looking after his sister, which was only available in Japan. Now, as a preface, while one could argue that since Nier Replicant is closer to Taro's original vision, that it would be better to focus on that version over Gestalt, I'll be centering the rest of this analysis on the latter, as that's the one that's more readily accessible to me as someone in the West. However, outside of a few lines of dialogue and the design, they're fundamentally the same game, really only delineating in how the story frames itself through its main character. Do the events of the game unfold through the eyes of a young, naive brother, or an older, tired father?
Friends?
Yes. You and I are friends now.
See here.
While on the topic of framing though, reflecting on the darker, weirder themes of Drakengard and how players responded to it, Taro tried to make a more positive experience out of Nier, focusing on lighter themes of friendship and combined effort.
Over here and give Vice a big sloppy kiss, Shadow Lord! Now pull your head out of your goddamn ass and start fucking helping us!
Okay, now, as much as we can chuckle about how Nier is just as somber as Drakengard, sans the flying demon babies, despite his intents otherwise, Taro did commit to those previously mentioned themes in his story. But, like a lot of his work, it came with a twist. And okay, this is something else I want you to keep in mind for the rest of this video, as it informed much of the decisions regarding Nier and the story it was telling. And that's that Taro drew a lot of inspiration from the events of September 11th, 2001, and the international conflicts that followed. Like many watching how the War on Terror unfolded in the Middle East, Taro was unsettled by how one's belief that they were in the right could lead humans to doing horrendous acts, ones that could lead to the deaths of thousands of innocents. So when planning out the narrative of Nier, he and his scriptwriters, Sawako Natori and Hana Kikuchi, went to work on creating a story that would focus on themes of conflict and the way it's justified. But we'll put a pin in that for later. Now knowing all that went into designing it and Taro finally getting the creative freedom he wanted, how was Nier received? Well, I'm gonna fast forward a little here and say that despite having a significant cult following in 2019, Nier did not review well for a variety of reasons when it was first published, especially in the West. Being released in the same time frame as BioShock 2, Mass Effect 2, and Red Dead Redemption, among other major hits that year, Nier simply couldn't hold up for a lot of reviewers and consumers, both in terms of how it played and its aesthetics. The gameplay was janky, repetitive, and all over the place, the world was bleak and visually uninteresting to look at, and the bloom effect was as blinding as a sunny day in a Canadian winter. Oh, Jesus Christ! The critics overall didn't pull their punches either.
Nier wants too much and therefore fails. The gameplay is not challenging, the graphics are below standard, and there is no originality whatsoever. So, just don't buy this game.
You don't feel you're the hero in a grand adventure as much as an ugly errand boy with bad hair and a sick daughter, wandering through the same uninspired environments over and over and coping with long stretches of nothing.
With so many genuinely good action RPGs that aren't riddled with archaic missions and gameplay, I have trouble recommending Nier solely on the basis of a decent but unevenly executed story.
Looking over the critical reception Nier received at the time, there was a lot of issues holding the game back in the mainstream. I'll freely admit that the game even lost me the first time I played it, and I didn't end up finishing it myself until years later. But with all this against Nier, why did it build such a strong audience then? Were there genuine flaws with Nier limiting it? Or was this a case of mistaken expectations like many cult classics before it? Well, let's dig into that. Alright, so to start, I'm going to try to keep the extensive story recap stuff to a minimum here, because there is a metric ton of lore to get into if I went over every detail, including the amount of short stories that go along with Nier and how it ties into Drakengard. So I'm going to approach this with the assumption you're coming into this with at least a rudimentary grasp of what happens. If you need a refresher on the specifics of Nier's plot though, I'd recommend Mr. Clemps' own analysis, as it works as a great recap, or ValkyrieAurora's lore summary, which covers all of Yoko Taro's work leading up to Nier Automata and how they're connected. Though that does touch on one of Yoko Taro's skills as a writer and director, as every one of his games works as a self-contained piece, despite being part of a larger body of work. Playing through Nier does not necessarily require the player to know or even be familiar with what happened in Drakengard 1. Taro creates each game with whatever messaging or theming he's building it around as the major focus, rather than continually building on what he did last time. To him, outright repeating what he's already done before feels like a failure, because video games are a medium that allows for so much more opportunities, both in how they engage the player and how they tell their stories. Though with that said, Taro definitely has his trademark design flourishes that he really enjoys. But we'll get to those in a minute. For now, let's get into the game proper. From the very start of the game, Nier pulls its first trick on the player for the service of one of its main themes, and that's perspective. When the game opens up, you find the main character Nier, or whatever you name him, and his sick daughter Yona fighting off a group of shades chasing after them. After a basic tutorial teaches you the fundamentals of the combat and magic systems that will come up, effectively presenting you with what the gameplay will look like later on, you find Yona has touched the grimoire that her dad explicitly told her not to touch, leading her to collapsing. But after the game fades away and flashes forward over 1,000 years, the natural assumption for the player is something has happened to the world that caused it to revert to this now medieval state that you're now meant to figure out. But these are ultimately somehow the same characters dealing with the same problem, which they're not. This Nier and Yona are the replicants of the originals we saw at the start, created by the Gestalt project meant to save humanity from the white chlorination syndrome, initiated when Nier grabs hold of the copy of the Grimoire Noir. But the fact we naturally conclude that they are still whole and the same characters is the setup for the rest of the turns that happen as the game continues. From the start, just like with other games that have done the whole, "Ha, tricked ya, you just did a genocide," we're viewing Nier through false assumptions solely due to how it frames itself. And to its credit, it does this incredibly well, because from here, everything is played fairly normally. We start off as Nier's taking care of Yona, doing odd jobs around the village in order to pay the bills, which mostly comes down to hunting down sheep and shades near the village. Though once you actually get into the gameplay proper outside of the opening tutorial, we start to see the first significant stumbling point for Nier that lost some players and critics early on. Unfortunately, since the days of Drakengard 1, the developers under Taro at Cavia were never the strongest at beat-em-up hack-and-slash combat and the way it's designed, and Taro never put the proper focus into how it worked, resulting in combat that's passable if I'm being generous. Like many reviewers pointed out when it was first released, the core combat is stiff and repetitive. Slash slash slash, slash slash slash, maybe roll out of the way when things get crowded, or use a charge attack if you have the time, repeat.
If you just continue to press the same button like X, 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 and Y, 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 and X, X, and Y, Y, Y again, you'll be sucked.
The combat isn't helped by the fact the game desperately needs a lock-on system, as it can be a challenge even hitting smaller enemies when they're moving around due to Nier's slidey attack animations. After the time skip midway through though, you are presented with more weapons to use, thus slightly opening up your options in combat. You have the original one-handed swords that do your basic combo, spears which are good for their longer reach, assuming you don't whiff, again a lock-on would have helped, and the two-handed greatswords, which can go right in the bin. Okay, that isn't entirely fair, because the two-handed swords are good for damage, until you unlock the Phoenix Sword and every other weapon can be tossed aside, but they really highlight how clunky and slow the combat is with how much wind-up time they require. It isn't until the end of the first major dungeon that Nier meets the floating talking dictionary, Grimoire Weiss, and the magic system is brought back in that the combat is actually improved somewhat. From here, you unlock more and more magic skills to use with each sealed verse found, such as Dark Whirlwind, Dark Gluttony, and Dark Framerate Stutter. In total, there are 8 spells to use, giving you some options in how to approach the combat, assuming you have the magic power to use them to their fullest, which grows more and more as Nier levels up. And the fact there's a slowdown once you activate them means you have a bit more time to charge up the harder hits and properly aim to get the most out of them, especially when the timer to finish off bosses comes up. However, even with the magic system, Nier's combat still has the depth of a puddle, and Dark Hand, Blast, and Lance can easily carry a majority of playthroughs, as they cover everything in terms of damage and range. So again, we're back to committing the same tedious combat loop continuously. But the extra options are appreciated if nothing else. On top of that, what doesn't help the combat at all is the game's bizarre tutorial system of unlocking explanations as drops from enemies only after already figuring out how to do the mechanic. So it's easy to miss things like the parry or sidestepping until late into the game, if at all. Though overall, this isn't that surprising, as the game already tends to undercut its combat by providing easy answers to problems, like the guard blocking all damage from the bullet hell sections in boss fights, making them entirely redundant. I don't know, maybe the designers could have gotten someone over at Platinum Games to come help polish up the gameplay? I'm told they're good at that kind of thing.
But Fox, isn't it a little hypocritical that you're calling out a game for having shoddy combat when one of its main messages is directed at how fighting enemies with little question of why might be wrong?
Yeah, that is a point one could make, ethereal voice of argumentative commentators, and we'll get more into that as we go. However, that theming could have been more impactful if the combat wasn't a tedious grind for most of the playtime, especially with the amount of fetch questing and backtracking that occurs along the way. If the player took any enjoyment from killing shades throughout the game, like Nier is implied to, because the combat was tight and well designed, or felt a strong need to eliminate the shade, rather than ignoring them for the most part if you didn't need to engage them due to it being a hassle, then the later gut punch reveals would be even more effective. But as it is, the gameplay is essentially a means to an end rather than meshing thematically. But to be fair, this isn't contrary to Yoko Taro's general approach to game design. One of the things you need to understand about Taro as a developer or a director is that he sees neither gameplay or story as the most important aspects of a game. They're simply a means toward achieving his image or vision of the game he's creating, for inspiring an emotional reaction out of the player, however that happens, either through using a bleak aesthetic to the world design to create this dreary atmosphere when combined with the music and narrative, or taking the tragic backstory of one of the main characters that you've grown to love and cramming it down your throat through the use of nearly an hour's worth of text, thus forcing the player to shift their perspective on how they take in the story. Let's look at the structure of Nier for an example. On the face of it, it starts off as an extremely standard RPG adventure. After finding Weiss, Nier learns he can save Yona if he teams up with a book and finds the different sealed verses hidden across the land, which can then be used to defeat Grimoire Noir, the supposed source of the black scroll affecting his daughter. Then along the way, venturing around to different places as news of potential other verses come in through Popola, you meet your colorful cast of characters. And at the end of every adventure, Nier returns back home to his daughter Yona to rest up for the next journey. All this feels quite predictable for a game of this style. Very comfy, which lulls you into a sense of complacency. There's the boss you have to toss the bombs into to defeat, here's your wide open plains to adventure between towns, here's hordes of enemies to slaughter as you level up. There's no questions of morality or why you're doing any of it, because we've hit all these beats before, and that's what makes the later twists that much stronger. Take the main cast, as it's built full of contradictions to the norm as they're expanded on. Where the typical cast of an RPG is often made up of your clean-cut hero, a smooth-talking rogue with a heart of gold, a healer, typically a woman, a gentle giant, and maybe a random outlier of sorts, the main character of Nier is an older man with a face like a half-melted wax figure, along with a smug talking book, a small sickly boy who gets turned into a magic skeleton, and a woman who dresses in lingerie, swears like a sailor, and can take a wicked punch. In every way, these are extremely atypical characters.
Vice!
Good to see you, Kaine. Although I don't think anyone has ever accused me of being a little bitch before.
And it isn't subversion for subversion's sake either. Because it's more than just that. Taro and the other designers of the game use classic tropes as a way to emphasize the changes that happen. If every aspect of the game was a subversion, it would start to feel like just a parody. You still have the classic hometown village, a stalwart hero out on an epic quest to save a loved one. The game is one water dungeon away from being Legend of Zelda. But then when the game switches over and subverts those RPG traditions, it's almost jarring, which creates this constant juxtaposition of the familiar and unfamiliar that starts to make you question why those established systems even exist. So much time is often put in the way a main character looks, either by making them traditionally easy to look at, such as your Clouds or your Yunas, or by giving them a gruff but mature design like with Geralt from The Witcher. And of course, aesthetics are important in a visual medium like video games, yet our main character looks like this. The fact many disregarded Nier in the West due to the protagonist looking like he's about to offer you some candy to get in his van, despite how they look, meaning very little to the actual story, goes to show how much stock we put in how a character appears before we become invested, and how that shapes our perspective of them.
You look just like I thought you would. You look really cool.
Knock it off.
This whole theme of looking at stories from a different perspective than you're used to comes up a lot throughout Nier, even translating into the gameplay itself, as it frequently plays around with how the player views it. With Nier, there was an intent of making something that was more unpredictable, as Taro believed that a game staying the same, never changing throughout, gets boring. So he wanted to create something that changed as you played it. At the start of Nier, you have a fairly traditional 3D person hack and slash game, but as it continues, that gradually shifts as it needs. At first by simply moving the camera to an overhead position like some classic top view games in the Lost Shrine, then including the occasional shoot 'em up sequence in the junk heap, a bit of side-scrolling beat 'em up gameplay in the Airy, and a set of camera point of view in Emil's Mansion and an odd homage to classic survival horror of all things, which later becomes an isometric Diablo-style perspective when you enter the underground lab. But this is again a moment where we have thematic cohesion conflicting with the actual quality of the gameplay, as these sections can be frustrating to actually get through once the novelty of the change wears off. When going through the underground lab, it's a genuine challenge to see the tells of enemy attacks, and even how you're meant to navigate through the levels. Probably the most controversial gameplay mix-up though is the section where you're put into playing a game of Zork to get through the Forest of Myth, which you can't speed through and cheat since the answers for questions at the end change each time depending on the story, requiring you to pay active attention to everything being written out. Now, to be clear, these text adventures aren't bad. The writing of the text is well done, it's masterfully descriptive, and you can feel how meticulous the writer was in their choice of wording to convey the right feelings. However, this section also speaks to the international taste that the game was balancing between, because while Japan didn't mind the text sections, Western audiences were incredibly mixed on them, especially in regards to the start of the second route, as Kaine's backstory is approximately 40 minutes worth of text at an average reading speed. No matter how well it's written, and it's indeed incredible, Starting up a section with over half an hour of nothing but text with no clear indicator of how long it'll be until you get back into the game is an incredibly risky gamble game design-wise. But endlessly meandering about Nier's questionable gameplay design is somewhat pointless since it's best described as a toddler in an arts and crafts class. Well-intentioned, but maybe in need of adult supervision. So let's get back to Taro's strong suit, specifically in Nier's scene direction. So after unlocking all the areas to the world and finding the sealed verses, the main cast must then defend against a horde of invading shades attacking the village, including the massive boss Jack of Hearts and some of the best visual set pieces of the game. The group is then pushed back into the library, and it's here where the villain of the game, the Shadow Lord, is finally revealed, along with their own grimoire, Grimoire Noir. Now, I'm not sure who it was on the dev team, whether it was Taro himself or someone else who did the cutscene direction for the game, but it's one of Nier's most underrated qualities, especially during this scene of the two grimoires interacting, which showcases how far cinematography can go to properly selling a moment in a game. This dialogue of Weiss and Noir debating about their reason for existing is done almost entirely in this blinding white room devoid of anything else, with two floating books talking to each other with no facial expressions. So the emotion of this sequence has to be conveyed entirely through the way the two books are framed against each other, with Noir eclipsing or pushing Weiss out of frame as they begin to overpower their consciousness, and the amazing voice work of Liam O'Brien and DC Douglas, aka Gara and Albert Wesker.
White and black shall fuse to one and set free shades to the world.
Fuse us? No, I cannot. I will not. I will never.
Outside of its stellar direction, this scene is also the second act drop, and the presumed lowest point of the characters going by a traditional 3-act structure. Boy, does that not end up being the case. After getting their asses handed to them by the Shadow Lord and his grimoire, Nier is left wounded, Kaine trapped in stone, and Yona is kidnapped and taken away by the Shadow Lord, leaving the group to sit back and lick their wounds after taking such an L, thus transitioning the game into its second half 5 years later. Now, while the first half is where the player spends their time learning about the world and characters, the latter half is actually where most of Nier's messaging and big reveals are actually made clear. The section before the time skip is essentially the opening act, setting the stage for the audience before you get the full story in the latter half and begin properly exploring the characters. The midpoint shortly after the time skip is also the starting point for the multiple replays of the game to get every ending, a writing trick that Taro really enjoys doing, and something that has a tendency to devalue the game in the eyes of anyone not willing to commit the time to do it. It also doesn't help that, in comparison to Drakengard before and Automata after it, you're repeating the same boss fights, the same levels, and the same everything in the 4 playthroughs of the game to get all the endings. However, this design is also important for the point the game is trying to deliver, at least for that second ending, because you have to have that initial playthrough first, which is played entirely straightforward from the perspective of the main characters exclusively, before everything gets recontextualized beyond that perspective, and you then have to commit those same actions knowing what you now know. And this is where we really have to crack into the deeper stuff with Nier. And the best, most pompous way of doing that in my opinion is by separating it into its major themes. I'm sorry everyone, I have to do this.